Hi, and welcome to another live chapter reading of Born to Fall, a Can't Resist You Book 2 by Brittany Ann, as presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. Gunshots echoed out, so faint she couldn't tell whether she'd heard them or simply dreamt them. Shooting up in her bed, Julia moved to the barred window of her chamber, squinting at the opaque glass as if that would somehow help her see through it. She sighed, then moved back to her bed, sitting at the edge and fingering through her curls a little too fast, a little too hard. Could the sound she heard really be a gunshot? Julia had only heard them once in her life, the day she almost had her freedom, the day she chose the wrong side again, and let an innocent man get killed for her mistake. He tried to help her, tried to save her, and now he was... Another bang. It was louder this time, no doubt coming from inside the compound. Oh my God. That was a gunshot, unmistakable, and it was here. Her heart began to beat faster in her chest. Could she hope? I met with the resistance. They're real, and they're going to save us. That's what Rain had told her, was it not? Julia doubted her at the time, played the role of the loyal, obedient wife that Master Allen had expected her to play. She discounted Rain's words and reminded her that the resistance wasn't real. But the moment Rain had spoken those words, a creeping hope snuck into Julia's heart. For what, she wasn't quite sure. For something, anything, different than what she currently had. Julia would even accept if this was her end, if a resistance official killed her himself for the part she played in that one man's death, the man who tried to save her. Nausea tightened the muscles in her throat, nearly making her vomit due to the weight of her crimes. That poor man who'd tried to save her was not the only innocent blood Julia had on her hands. So, yes, even if this was her end, it would be a fine end. Better than the endless days of pretending for her captor, of wishing she were dead so she wouldn't have to feel his touch ever again. Another gunshot echoed through the hall, so loud it made her jump. She stood from the stiff mattress and moved to the back wall of the room, pressing her bare shoulders against the cold concrete. And then she waited. Anxiety pulled in her gut as her left hand began to shake. Julia lifted both hands to her hair again, brushing through the ends so forcefully she tore a few pieces right out. It was silly to be anxious about the situation. What more could happen to her? She'd been beaten, raped, tortured. She'd been held as a prisoner for more than a year. She'd watched the only light in her life destroyed. Julia had nothing. She had died months ago, maybe even longer. The fact that breath still eased in and out of her lungs, that her heart still beat in her chest, it didn't mean a thing. Julia welcomed death, which is why even she was surprised when her door swung open and she screamed at the top of her lungs. Chapter 1. It's a funny feeling to walk down a street you grew up on and to feel your skin crawl with the crippling knowledge that you don't belong there anymore. But really, had she ever? As Julia walked down the broken cement path toward her childhood home, it wasn't just a sense of belonging that she lacked. It was a sense of safety. Every time a breeze caressed the trees, every time a child laughed somewhere in the distance, every time the chirps and chimes of nature sounded out, Julia felt afraid. More than afraid, Julia felt terror. Months had passed since the resistance had taken over the district. Months since Derek had stormed into her chamber, ripped a UNR officer off her, and carried her to safety in his arms. Months since she looked at the bloodied, broken face of the monster who'd stolen everything from her. That monster still haunted her every single day. She walked at a quick pace, partially to keep warm in the surprisingly bitter October air, and partially because she knew that if she slowed down for even a moment, she'd never follow through with her plan. She had been putting it off for weeks. It was time. As she approached the house, a chill ran down her spine. She slowed as she approached the dead, unkempt grass that had once been a beautiful shade of emerald green. When she reached the walkway that led up to the building's front door, all she could do was pull her coat tightly around her torso and stare. She barely recognized it. The bright white paint on the siding of her childhood home had turned yellow and green and brown from years of neglect. The navy blue shutters were bent and broken, barely hanging onto their hinges, and one of them missing altogether. 2 of the 4 windows in the front of the house were shattered, shards of glass sticking out from the frames and threatening to maim anyone who entered. Nausea rolled in Julia's stomach as water raced to her eyes and threatened to spill over. This was not her home anymore. "You all right?" Her heart leapt into her throat, and she jumped a foot in the air as panic rocked through her. Her sneaker caught on a crack in the sidewalk, and she began to fall, only to be grabbed by strong arms and pulled up before she hit the ground. Julia squeezed her eyes shut and prayed to be somewhere else, anywhere else. Then she felt the warmth of arms that held her and smelled the familiar scent of pine that always hung around him. "Derek?" she asked, keeping her eyes closed and working to quiet her rapidly beating heart. "Did I scare you?" His voice was dangerously low, but it still somehow sounded kind. She opened her eyes and stared at him, knowing she didn't need to answer. It was a silly question, and he knew that, so she wouldn't answer. "What are you doing here?" she asked instead. "I was heading down to the meeting." "This isn't the way to the meeting." All meetings were held inside the town center, and this was quite a ways away from the high walls that surrounded the center compound. "You were following me." Again. She spat. She regretted her tone and felt the panic pick up again. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude." Hey, you're fine. Relax." He rubbed her arms and coaxed her eyes back to his. When she found his deep brown eyes gazing at her, her heart began to thud once more in her chest. He was too tall, too big, too muscular, too dangerous, too enticing. "I saw you come down here, and I was worried. You seemed upset." She swallowed hard and turned her head, looking back to the building that stood behind her. It used to be a house, a home. It wasn't anymore. "Is this the place?" Derek asked. She sighed. "Yes." "Do you want me to go in with you?" Her eyes snapped back to his. "I'm never going in there." "Well, if you change your mind." "I won't." She watched his shoulders drop as he released a breath of air, then looked away, unwilling to see the judgment enter his eyes. She looked to his hand on her shoulder, his huge hands that could break her in two, that had taken countless lives, that were calloused and scarred from the horrors they'd seen. Those hands had been nothing but kind to her from day one. So why was she still so afraid of them? Julia knew the answer, and it wasn't Derek. No, it was the man whose hands were clean and uncalloused, smooth and dainty even. The man whose hands had beat her, held her down, violated her, and slaughtered the only man she'd ever loved. Yes, that was the reason Julia was so scared of Derek, of men, of people. When Derek's hands touched her cheek, she flinched. He frowned. She hurt. "It's not you," she explained in her head. "It's him. He's still in my head. He'll always be in my head." "Would you like to come to the meeting with me?" Derek asked. Julia released the air in her lungs, grateful for the subject change. "No, I shouldn't be there." "Why not?" Julia raised her brows. "I'm not supposed to know about official business." A line she'd said before, a line she'd rehearsed, a line that made her feel sick. "Jules, we're not the UNR. We don't pull that crap." His thumb feathered over her cheek again, but this time she didn't flinch at his touch. "I'd love it if you came. I think it'd be really good for you and for others. Is it? She stopped and thought about her words. She worried that she was taking too long to respond, but Derek waited patiently, never pushing her or pressing for anything. He just stood there, present and aloof at the same time, depending on what she needed. Somehow, he always knew. Is it safe? She asked, finally comfortable enough to come out with it. Yes, it's safe. You're safe. He seemed to chew on his inner cheek, as if he were thinking about whether or not he should say more. I would kill any man who tried to hurt you. Julia's heartbeat quickened once more, but finally it wasn't from fear. In a normal world, that line would horrify her. It definitely wouldn't sound reassuring or romantic or sexy. They didn't live in a normal world. The corners of her lips twitched and almost lifted to a smile. Okay, she agreed. I'll go. Derek put his arm around her shoulders as they began to walk towards the center of town, but she couldn't help but turn back and look at the building one last time. She saw herself there, young and innocent, and oblivious to reality. She saw him there, tending to the grass and to the garden and to her. She saw them together, happy and whole and unbroken. She saw the paint on his nose from when she helped him to paint those shutters. And now they were broken and chipped and decayed, ghosts of the beautiful things they once were. Just like her, just like him. Her home had died when he did, and so had she. She turned away and bit back tears as she pressed forward, grateful to the locks of her hair that shielded her face as the first of the tears spilled over. It was nice to have an office that wasn't underground. Derek was still getting used to the new headquarters of the Resistance, despite the fact that they'd taken the compound a few months back. As Derek had learned, it took more than some months to get used to the real world after spending the majority of the past 14 years living underground. He sat in the cushioned chair and couldn't help but think about how far they'd come. In the midst of his thinking, he felt the cushion bend with movement beside him. He turned to see Julia, sitting there with her auburn curls shielding her face, her knees to her chest, and her arms hugging them. He could see the subtle movement of her fingertips beneath her hair and knew that she was picking at her lip, a nervous habit of hers, and he'd come to recognize in the months that he'd known her, the months since he'd saved her. You okay, Jules? He asked, as he reached over and touched his hand to her knee. She jumped at his touch, and it broke his damn heart. It didn't matter how many times he assured her that she was safe. It didn't matter how gentle he was with her. It didn't matter how much time had passed since she'd seen the corpse of that monster who would never hurt her again. She was still terrified. What is this meeting about? She asked, evading his question. She did that a lot, but he always let it slide. One day, she'd feel completely comfortable with him. Actually, that was one of the reasons she was at this meeting. Her and Rain had a shared history, so he'd asked her for ideas to help Julia feel more comfortable. She'd quickly suggested bringing her to the meeting, showing her how the leaders were here so she can see how different things were with the Resistance. Updates, planning, the usual business, nothing too daunting. He wasn't actually sure what this meeting was about, but that tended to be what they discussed. They liked to meet regularly, make sure everyone was on the same page and needs were being met. Julia nodded at his answer. He watched as she shifted in her chair and returned her hand to her lip. He didn't mean to, but he reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling it towards him. Why do you do that? He asked her, as he brought her hand down to the cushion and gently massaged circles into her wrist. She stared at him with gaping, coffee-colored eyes, so wide and deep he thought he may get lost in them. Do you feel that? He stared back at her. Feel what? The way she looked at him touched a new part of Derek, a part he'd rarely spent time with anymore. Something primal in him stirred, and he couldn't help but think about touching far more than just her wrist. Her lips fell ever so slightly open, and he could have sworn she'd had the exact same thought he did. All right, boomed Sawyer's voice, pulling both of their attentions away from each other and toward him in the center of the room. Let's get started. Julia snatched her hand away and wrapped her arms around her wrist. Derek just leaned back into the couch, celebrating the small victory of her not flinching at his touch. Right, and that's all for today. That was Born to Fall, Can't Resist You Book 2 by Brittany Ann, as presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Bye.